Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Lavaside Chats. This time I sat down with Byron, who goes by Abolish Prenups on Twitter, and we dove straight into a conversation about creativity, about how a lot of content being put out today is really just recycled content, and about what it actually takes to create something that is truly original. It's a longish one, so I say we get straight to it. Please enjoy this Lavaside chat with Abolish Prenups. So Byron, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, HK. I guess that's the appropriate way to address you, is obviously your Twitter handle, Harvey.
Yeah, I think that works for now.
Cool.
So I thought of diving into this conversation with something we talked about last time we spoke, which was you were explaining how a lot of the content that you see today seems to be like a recycled or digested form of other content. And it gets into this like Ouroboros loop of content just being inspired by other content and not much stuff being inspired from primary experiences that people are having. So yeah, I'm curious like how you see that, whether it's in filmmaking, because I know that's your thing, or just in other fields as well.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of an epidemic, to be honest. That might sound a little bit extreme, but I really do think the problem has become so rife that it's reaching or has already reached pretty epic proportions of interfering with what I would consider great artistic work. And as you say, it's this regurgitating of what is already out there in the zeitgeist of art and culture. There's plenty of people that have spoken about this probably in more depth and detail than I can now, but I can certainly present my own sort of take on the dilemma. And I mean, the idea of it being a problem probably first was crystallized in me from a photographer that I was doing some work with. And I think he might have implanted the idea of a snake eating its tail as an easy way to encapsulate this problem. And that essentially, if you as a creative person or an artist are relying on existing work in order to inspire your own work as the only primary or central mode of inspiration, essentially you're getting information that is already abstracted, you're getting information that is already colored by other people's experiences and tastes and so forth. And there is very much this kind of cyclical effect. And I guess for me personally, this is particularly present in the film world. I could probably identify it in most creative spheres, but as you say, I'm a filmmaker and I consume a fair chunk of films, and I spend a lot of my time sort of absorbing that world in its current state. And it's so easy to identify in the film world, and I would say most people, just your everyday person is more than willing to complain about the state of film in this regard. Most people have had the conversation of, I can't believe that they're remaking this film. I can't believe they're just revamping that franchise. I can't believe that there are no new and interesting stories coming out of Hollywood, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the continual referring to the comic book world as a means of creating bankable projects is continually there, and much to many people's dismay, including my own. Not that I'm, vehemently against comic book films. I'm just saying it's a little bit sad if that's all we have to offer as the central output of what Hollywood can provide. And so, yeah, more specifically with film, I think that, as a millennial myself, an older millennial in my mid-30s, I'm just constantly surrounded by other millennials who, and I can see it, personally, firsthand through the experiences with people, but also just through the work that I can see that's made, whether I've met the filmmakers or not, that they are essentially people that are still enamored with a certain nostalgia for the films that they grew up in, be it the 90s, the 80s, or even the early 2000s now, and really just take it upon themselves to try and create, a carbon copy of sorts, or at least a new take of this old type of film. Perhaps like a really good example is like Super 8. I don't know if you saw that film.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of an obscure one to mention, but yeah, for some reason I always think of that when I think about this problem, because it really was essentially a throwback, obviously, to a little bit out of my depth here because I'm not even massively into this genre, but I guess like, the Steven Spielberg type films of the 90s, I guess like The Goonies is probably the big one that it's maybe referencing. And I'm not sure if that's Steven Spielberg or not, but I feel like it might as well be.
Super 8 is Steven Spielberg, right?
I'm not sure actually. I think it might be J.J. Abrams.
Right, you're right.
Yeah, which I think for many people is a contemporary Spielberg. But nonetheless, it is just so much, not obviously only in its content in terms of the sorts of themes and characters that it has a reference to those earlier films, but just stylistically, what it has to offer the audience is just all nostalgia, it's all throwback, and it's nothing new. And so that's, I guess, what I'm seeing in the film world. That's what I would consider to be a quintessential example of this problem. But as I say, I think you can see it across many domains, and I guess the sort of crude way of articulating what's happening is that in many domains you basically have people swallowing their Instagram feed, their Pinterest feed, Tumblr, whatever it may be, and that becomes their primary mode of inspiration. And the, I guess, antithesis of that is the Werner Herzog sort of school of thought, which is that in order to be truly inspired, in order to make work that has real truth to it, has real depth to it, has something that has real meaning, and I guess reality, you have to have your own personal experiences. And he, in an extreme way, has articulated this by saying that his perfect film school is to throw people out into the jungle. And although he may not have been entirely serious with that comment, I do think that it's not a crazy thing to throw out there, and whether it's half joke or entirely joke, I'm not sure, but or even entirely serious, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think it has a lot of legs to it, and I do try to embody that school of thought to a large degree myself.
Cool. Yeah, so before diving into the primary experiences element of all this, just in what you were mentioning, I was thinking like what can explain this problem of the digesting and redigesting content. Why does this problem exist today? And two explanations that came up to mind when you were mentioning comic book movies. I thought, the film houses, of course, have the interest or pressure to have like these huge blockbuster films and make money. So there's that, incentive that might be going against creating something that's completely new and that might be a little bit more risky from the financial perspective. And then when you mentioned Instagram and Pinterest and consuming all these feeds, I wonder if, something that's new today is that there is so much content that it's super easy to fill our waking hours with it, and essentially, end up crowding out all time that we could have used to have primary experiences by doing something else, where we're not consuming something that's already been created by someone else.
Yeah, so the first thing, definitely there is an economic incentive to essentially lean on the back of an existing franchise that has a fan base. I had a screenwriter, lecturer, or professor once say that basically studios love to be the first person to do something second. So by that it means they want to see that such an idea is going to be highly successful,
Mm-hmm.
and then they want to be the first person to jump on that bandwagon, before it starts to get exploited too much, or lose its spark. Obviously, by the fourth and fifth, sequel to a franchise, the numbers are starting to drizzle out. But if you're number two as a sequel or whatever project attached to a franchise, that's where you can really make the big bucks if the first has really gone down very well. So that idea, I guess, has always made economic sense. At the end of the day, yes, things like studios are risk averse, and when it comes to the film industry, the thing I guess I like to remind people of is that we live in a particularly conservative time, because the era that I fell in love with in the early 2000s, there was a lot of money coming in from DVD sales, DVD rentals, and then box office sales. And so studios had money to burn on riskier projects. And so I like to cite examples like Fight Club, Eternal Sunshine, being John Malkovich. For example, these are indie films, but they still commanded a decent sized budget. I can't remember exactly what Fight Club is, but it's probably 30-ish, maybe even 50 or 60 $1 million budget, which is unheard of today for such a crazy script that doesn't necessarily have much marketability. And so today it's a very different economic landscape in the film industry. Things are certainly looking at least more stable now that we have the streaming world down packed and we know exactly what we're in for. And there is certainly money coming in for those streaming services, but it's still a shadow of what it once was for a certain segment of the film industry. In terms of the other point you made, which is basically you're saying that there's just not enough hours in the day now that we're all addicted to social media. Is that fair to say? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, maybe I won't simplify it as much to number of hours, but just like there's a fire hose of content, multiple fire hoses of content out there waiting for you, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. And I can just imagine that makes it easier to just get caught up in that cycle and not be as motivated to go pursue your own primary experiences that can inspire your own art.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I do think that in many ways, Twitter, Instagram, and various social media is so perfectly engineered to develop a pretty potent or intense hit of stimulation, both from a creative perspective, particularly, I guess, on Instagram, if you're a filmmaker, for example, and you're following a whole bunch of highly creative people that are producing audiovisual content that can really satiate you in a 15-second Insta story or a 1-minute post. I think it is just so easy to let that, those intense short bursts just provide your inspiration. And over, I guess, the past decade, these social media platforms have gotten progressively good at providing that hit. So it is, I would say, problematic that it is just so good at that, and it is so tempting to simply rely on it. And I think it is going to take a real conscious effort on creatives to have the discipline to curb either their usage on there or even, to be very, very mindful about who they're following and to create some kind of curbing effect through that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And with the other part that you mentioned, which is the nostalgia, all these millennials creating content, creating films that, throw us back to the 80s, 90s, aughts. I feel like this isn't necessarily something new, like the nostalgia bit of wanting to create stuff in previous decades. Usually whenever it was that you went through childhood or were a teenager, because you have all those really strong emotions and memories associated to that time. But somehow it seems like today it's happening on a much larger scale. I don't know if you share that impression. You obviously have a much better sense of the film world than I do.
Yeah, my mind just started to drift into the much broader, slightly more philosophical perspective on this. And I was trying to remember, there is, I guess you would call him a philosopher, if not a commentator or cultural commentator. Oh, I think his name is like Mark Fraser or Foster. Hopefully I can remember later and you can maybe throw it in the description or something.
Sure.
But he's essentially, I think, a postmodernist who has an intense critique of capitalism. And, you know, for what it's worth, my whole take on that is a little bit more complex and it's a little bit more of a love-hate relationship. But he, from what I've gathered, and I really want to read more of his stuff and watch more of his interviews, but from what I gathered, has a very interesting sort of take on how much we are all essentially just living in the aftermath of previous decades now at this point in history.
Mm-hmm.
That essentially the idea of any new culture is a complete farce and that we are literally just constantly regurgitating, I suppose, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and I guess potentially noughts. But that we just live in this kind of haze of just perpetual regurgitation. And I guess he probably cites how much the internet has played a role in that, but also how much potentially capitalism has played a role in that. So that's like the much broader take, which again, I don't have much more than I can personally offer, but hopefully I can steer some people to look into him because I think it's super interesting. And I myself want to educate myself more on that particular perspective. But the more specific, I guess, angle that I have is that, yes, it's true. We've always, you know, as a species been referential of the past and have always wanted to be connected with our history, our ancestry, tradition, culture, I guess, almost by definition is something historical. But like you imply, I do think that there is another level of it that has accelerated in recent history. I do think that the internet plays a huge role in that phenomenon. And specifically with the film world, I think there's a number of factors that have enabled this acceleration of this problem of being enamored with the past and being solely focused on nostalgia. And if I were to list those, I would say, first of all, yeah, probably the economic disincentives to take risks as a result of it, you know, the film industry just being less profitable than it once was. But then also, I would even cite things like the culture war and political correctness and a general hesitance for people to step outside of their comfort zone into something that might ruffle a few feathers. And I guess that's entangled with the internet in the sense that I think people are more conscientious about stuff they put their name to that's literally going to be impossible to delete and it's going to exist forever. They're more conscientious about the fact that they can be cancelled, that their social groups, etc., you know, dependent on them sort of saying the right thing at certain points. And I guess generally the increase in divisiveness has meant that people, you know, inside their echo chambers are increasingly less exposed to ideas outside of their own paradigms. And this means that they're just increasingly unaware of new ideas and experiences outside of the, you know, little pocket of the internet and little pocket of the real world, which are obviously highly interrelated. So those are probably three big things that I think factor into why we're particularly enamored with the past at the moment. And essentially they're all incentives against risk-taking. They're all incentives against conjuring things that are truly new, because new is, essentially always dangerous. It ought to be always dangerous. And I think that, taking the safe option for various reasons is increasingly the go-to for people generally, but especially creatives.
Yeah. So who are the creatives that are taking the other path? Like, you mentioned Werner Herzog. I don't know much about him beyond him being sort of this madman filmmaker. But I'm really curious to get a sense of, who are the type of people that are completely disregarding these trends in terms of regurgitating content and doing the easy thing by appealing to nostalgia, and who instead are going out and creating something that's truly from scratch and truly trying to add something that's new into whether it's film, music, whatever, and really make some waves that way.
Such a good question. The very, very bleak answer is that I just really don't. Yeah, I mean, basically that's what it is for me in the film industry. There's obviously positives and cons to that. I mean, I feel really inspired by the fact that, as I embark on writing a feature film myself, I really feel like the world is kind of ripe for something that is brave enough to truly think outside the box, and to not be beholden to groupthink and not be beholden to political correctness, so to speak. And I guess this sort of narrowing paradigm of thought that exists in Hollywood and California and the film industry at large. The funny thing is that, even my quote unquote heroes that I sort of grew up on and were inspired by have, I think, gradually over time succumbed to this groupthink as well. And I think it's only natural and human that once you reach a certain level of success, you do generally become complacent, and you just have less incentive again to take big risks. Why risk having a solid career? But I think more than that, it's just that they are sort of stuck in a certain paradigm, and they can't sort of see their way out of it. I grew up loving Charlie Kaufman. I loved Spike Jonze. I love Miranda July. I probably have, a reasonable amount of faith in Miranda July. She's not a hugely popular name, so you might not be familiar with her. But
what
I would say that,
what has she done?
She has only made a few films. One has just recently come out, which I haven't seen yet, called Gajillionaire. But I absolutely love her debut feature film. I think it's truly amazing. It's called Me and You and Everyone We Know. Mm-hmm. And I cite her as a hero because she's a little bit of a multidisciplinary artist, to use a slightly pretentious term. But she is a writer. She's a novelist who's produced some amazing writing. She's, as I mentioned, a filmmaker. She also acts in her films. She's a writer, director. She is also a performance artist. And so just a general artist, period. And I think that has helped her a little bit to remain open and brave and courageous. And I guess one of the things that I love about her is that she's just so willing to be vulnerable as a person and as an artist, and you can see that vulnerability in her work very clearly. And I also commend her for kind of pushing the medium a little bit on Instagram. I think out of all of my heroes that I grew up on, she's the only one who is really doing some interesting stuff on social media. And so I definitely give her credit there, and I think she is managing to be a little bit open and brave as a result of that. But ultimately, to answer your question more directly, I am a Lars von Trier fan. And again, he is of an older ilk, an older generation, and I don't know that his best work is to come. I think it might be behind him. But nonetheless, he does still very much embody what I consider to be just the fierce bravery and courage that it takes to make truly good work. And although I don't know enough about his personal life to say that he has put a decent emphasis on personal experiences, or as you call them, primary experiences, I I have a lot of faith that he does embody a lot of that philosophy and has that, you know, Werner Herzog streak in him as well.
Yeah. What's some of his work? I'm not familiar with him.
So Lars von Trier, a Danish filmmaker, he was at least one half of the people responsible for coining or forming the Dogma 95 manifesto. Essentially, the Dogma 95 manifesto, I think it was made in 1995, was a manifesto that stipulated a whole bunch of rules that him and his buddies, it might have just been him and one other guy, I'm not too sure, but that they had to adhere to in their films in order to essentially already stave away some of the temptations of making work that was superficial and devoid of true heart and soul. And so those rules were things along the lines of, you weren't allowed to use artificial lighting. You weren't allowed to use any production design. You had to use what was there. You could only use sound recorded on set. You couldn't bring in any sound design in post. Extremely limiting rules for a filmmaker, but were there because they already felt in 1995 that films were succumbing to glitz and aesthetic and cinematography, I should say pretty cinematography, and they were losing its connection with the fundamentals of film, be it story, character, and performances. So out of the Dogma 95 manifesto came, you know, what I consider to be, just beautiful pieces of work. Dogville is one of my favorite films. Dancer in the Dark, Breaking the Waves, The Idiots. I think from what I've read, all of them, I think might break one or two rules. Yeah. So, you know, there's contention about whether any of his films managed to fully stick to the manifesto they wrote. But like I say, I just mentioned a few of them. There were a lot of rules that were extremely limiting. The point for me is that they were thinking in those terms and forcing themselves to really maintain purity in their work. And I think their work was better for it. And I mean, today in 2020, you know, it would, I just don't think there's anyone even close to thinking in those terms and doing something like a Dogma 95 manifesto. That kind of courage, I think, is basically nowhere to be seen.
Yeah. I'm thinking about all of this right now in terms of artists who have something to say and they're gonna find a way to say it regardless of the medium, and those who are just playing around with the medium itself. Like when you mentioned the woman director, what was her name?
Miranda July.
Right. So you mentioned that she's a multidisciplinary artist, and I always find characters like her really interesting. Like right now, Alejandro Jodorowsky comes to mind, who's not only a filmmaker, but also a poet. He was a tarot reader in Paris for a long time, also a theater director. So with these characters that really, you know, get involved in all these different forms of expression, I get a sense that really what's driving them is something that they have deep down inside that they want to express and communicate with the world. And they don't limit themselves to just one discipline, because that's usually too narrow for them to express whatever it is they want to express in its totality. And I guess the counterpoint to that is someone, you know, this might be a little bit more cynical, but just like someone who says, oh, I want to make films, and they get into filmmaking and they learn the craft of filmmaking and they become really good at that craft, but might not have that, you know, deep thing within themselves that they're trying to communicate with the world, and which is, you know, that's the thing that they are driven by to not just regurgitate past content or lean on nostalgia or any of these things, but really go beyond whatever it is that's being put out there today.
Yeah, I think that like there are such compelling arguments for either school of thought. The whole conundrum of being a jack of all trades, master of none is a real issue and has a lot of weight to it. And, you know, I'm constantly having this debate with myself as someone who identifies as a bit of a generalist and easily gets pulled in various directions. And at a certain point, it can be the detriment to ever fully excelling at one thing. Because I do, at the end of the day, philosophically believe strongly in the idea that if you want to be truly great at something, you kind of need to block everything else out and just gradually hone that thing more and more and more. And obviously there are so many examples, if not most examples of people who've created truly great work in any domain, have had that attitude. But I guess I feel like this other way really deserves to have a torch shone on it as well, because I think at the very least, it's such a great way of forcing openness and forcing a fluidity of mind and being able to just constantly think outside the box. Because that, I think, maybe we can sort of imply from this conversation, seems to be something that's harder to achieve these days, maybe. Or maybe it's just something that ebbs and flows with time. Maybe I'm just incredibly biased, and it's not a trend of, there's not a trend that exists of decreasing open-mindedness. But I would say at the very least, regardless of whatever period in history you're in, there is a crude trick that you can deploy to help you remain open, and that is to step outside of the domain that you spend most of your time in and try something completely different. And that will, you know, at the very least, trigger some kind of new neural pathways in your brain. It'll potentially allow you to see problems and scenarios in a slightly different light. And so for someone like Miranda July, yeah, I mean, I think that her debut feature film, for example, was probably bettered by the fact that she was a performance artist. I can see some of the scenes and some of the writing being influenced by that. And at the very least, it just creates a point of difference in her work, something different, something you haven't seen before. And yeah, I think for myself, I'm definitely using this trick, shall we say, as a way of keeping my mind open as well. Like right now, as I'm embarking on writing a feature, I'm trying to get into writing poetry, even though poetry has no direct implications to the film, just because I think it'll just change the way that I approach writing, and it just creates another, you know, another tool in the arsenal, and just gets me thinking differently. I'm also thinking about, you know, making a board game. Recently was something that's come to mind, and I genuinely can see that the way that my brain has to work to create a board game will help in my openness as I tackle other creative projects.
Yeah. Wait, can you
Yeah.
say more about the board game? Like, I'm just trying this on, like thinking, what would it be like to design a board game? And I'm already getting the sense that it'll be, you know, maybe difficult, but really interesting project to tackle.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't talk too soon because it really hasn't reached any kind of solid phase yet, other than just the general idea of making one in my brain. But it is something that I thought on and off on about the years. I guess maybe in my early 20s particularly, I really quite enjoyed board games, and I thought it'd be a cool medium to participate in as a creator. I guess that feeling has never fully gone away, and that I do think that there's something to be said about, you know, when one aspect of culture is taken off, it's a good time to try another aspect. So obviously video games are more popular than they've ever been. So in some ways, it's a good time to make board games because no one's expecting it. I mean, I think you could probably attribute some of the success of Cards Against Humanity, which was, you know, an absolute cultural hit, to the fact that there just aren't really, you know, many board games that get made these days, and I would say that people are kind of hungry for that sort of real world interaction that you don't get from video games, and people are hungry for ways of just bringing us together into the same space. And you could probably also find data that we're, you know, more socially awkward than we've ever been. People are, or, you know, Zoomers, for instance, you could probably find some data that they have less social skills than previous generations. And so, yeah, things like board games, I think if you can get it right, if you can touch a nerve on contemporary culture, have a real chance of having an audience. And so, I guess as I sort of find myself more and more clearly defined in this kind of Twitter clique that we're in, I'm starting to throw around the term metamodernist more and more. Obviously, we've used the word spiritual in our little chat.
Yeah.
These are all things that I feel like I would like to embody in a board game in some way, shape, or form. Essentially, take it upon myself to try and create something that taps into these themes and somehow focuses on the common ground between people, regardless of their, let's say, identity or background, etc. That's obviously a very lofty aim without any specific ideas that I'm throwing at you, but I think you should start with what it is you want to achieve. And so I love, like, Boulder Dash, for example, if you've ever heard of that. That's a game that pretty much already does the things that I'm looking to achieve. It's a highly creative game. Have you heard of it?
I'm familiar with the name, but not anything beyond that.
It's very simple. I think the later version had 5 categories. One of those categories is like the name of a film, and you just have to write a short blurb, like 1 to 2 sentences, on what that film is about. And so it's called Boulder Dash because you're essentially bluffing or lying or creating a fictionary, a piece of fiction. And yeah, in that particular category, it's creating a fake film story. And so I love it because it forces creativity. And again, I think there is a theme of unity there because it's just highly universal. You know, you don't need a trivia background. You don't need to know any kind of niche, any niche things, you know. Yeah, it can really appeal to anyone.
Cool. Yeah, I've never had never been big on board games or card games. And I would even extend that to any sort of competition because I was never like the sporty type of kid in school. And it wasn't until recently that some friends of mine really got into playing Settlers of Catan. And I started joining them for these games, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I found it super interesting how our social dynamics in this group of friends would completely change during gameplay. So, you know, for example, one friend was, you know, more on the shy, quieter side. Would have never expected her to have an intense competitive streak. But once we started playing, she was the most ruthless at the table. And it became really fun to, you know, be like fucking each other over through these different moves, and just sort of that friendly competition and friendly banter, you know, helping each other out at some point, but then screwing each other over at another point. That as a social dynamic, it's not something that would normally play out outside of playing a game. But within this container where it's understood it's just a game and we're doing this for fun, it was really interesting to sort of LARP those dynamics, you know?
Yeah.
So I find just the idea of designing a board game to be super fascinating, because I would imagine that to make it a really good one, you'd have to have a good sense of social dynamics and gameplay and the user experience of the game, and have all of these things in mind as you go creating the rules and basically set up this container within which gameplay is going to occur.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, hats off to those that create these games that bring out these sides of people that you don't get to see elsewhere. And the way that you just described that just further increased my appreciation for the form or the medium. You know, these ideas that people are behaving in such a way that, you know, you may know them for 10, 20 years and never get to see unless you play that particular game with them.
Right.
That's really something, you know. And yeah, I really do think board games have the potential to provide a really interesting experience for people. And I would love it if the whole stigma of nerdism or geekism were be able to be eroded a bit from the notion of board games. Because yeah, I do think that more than ever, at least in my life, we are in need of having new types of dynamics amongst people in social settings, and that we just need to spend more time, you know, communicating with each other and in any way, but particularly in ways that maybe test us and bring out new and interesting sides of us.
Totally.
And actually, one thing that I thought of was Miranda July also created this app. Actually, I think this is a great example of how much of a multidisciplinary person she is. But she created an app called, I think it's Somewhere or Someone, where basically, I mean, it's a totally crazy idea that, you know, clearly didn't have huge amounts of viability, but at the same time is at least a very great piece of art, if not more than that. But what it was that if you wanted to send a message to someone, what this app did, or does, I think it might be closed now, but what it did was it sent a message to someone near you who would then physically come to you and read it out to you. So again, like, she's all about trying to get people to interact, particularly strangers. This is something I guess I'm also passionate about, is trying to get strangers to interact with each other. So essentially that's what this app did, was that you would receive a message from someone, but through the vessel of some stranger coming to you and reading it out to you.
Okay, so let's say I want to send a message to you. A third person, this stranger, would be the one to deliver it to you by reading it aloud.
Yeah.
Got it.
There's a little video online that explains it, and it has like a few use cases, and it's kind of cute. And basically, I think one of them is, you know, someone professing their love for somebody else, and it's told by
the stranger.
You know, some huge old man with a beard, for example. Even though it's a love letter that comes from, you know, some petite young woman or something like that. So yeah, it's very cool.
I mean, that's like a whole genre of potential games that could be interesting, you know, like not happening around the table with people you know, but like on a much larger scale with strangers. Like you mentioning this app just reminded me of another one. This was when I was living in Korea, so around 2012, 13. And it was an app where you would drop secret messages around the city. And it was almost like a digital message in a bottle type of thing, but it would stay in that specific geological location.
Wow.
So then someone else with that app who would be walking by that street corner, for example, would get a notification that there's a little message nearby, and they could go and read it. So it's almost like just stashing these little messages in random places around the city, and anyone can pick them up and read them.
I love that. I love it.
So yeah, that just makes me think what sort of, you know, large scale games could be played like that through apps. Almost like Pokemon Go would be an example of that, but something that's using that same medium and application and augmented reality and like a huge board map, quote unquote, the whole city or however big you want to do it, but with a totally different theme and gameplay and experience for the people playing it.
Yeah, my mind has always drifted into that terrain as well. And I think maybe my long-term plans are probably to get involved in something like that. And I guess I would love to bring my sort of director filmmaker brain into that kind of world where I feel like trying to create experiences for people that has some degree of curation and vision already brought to the table, but at the same time is open enough that people bring their own experiences, and you open it up, you know, to the audiences and users to create the experiences, is something that I think we'll likely see in the future. I think that we're kind of dilly-dallying our way to get there. I'm kind of surprised that, you know, it hasn't cropped up sooner, but I do think we'll get to that kind of place, and that ultimately this kind of thing will replace things like films to a large degree. Obviously, I think there'll always, you know, be a market for any sort of medium. People still go to the theater, you know, people still read books, poetry still exists, puppeteers still exist, but at the same time, culture shifts and things become increasingly and less popular. And I do think that one day, essentially video games and films will be superseded by this kind of real world interactive environment, and life itself will be heightened by technology. And I guess the way I see this kind of thing playing out is that things like music will very much become almost a designed aspect of your life, and yeah, the way you move and go through your day will have this sort of highly designed and creative aspect to it.
So like music that's responsive to whatever it is you're doing at that moment in the day.
Yeah, I've always thought that like life would be just so much better if it was scored, you know. And I think that it's a big reason why I'm attracted to film, is the relationship between music and visuals. And I honestly think that my love for film is at least half just the music. Like I just love music so much, and music is so universal. Basically everybody loves music. And yeah, I feel like the idea of things like music being introduced into your waking life in a way that's technologically advanced and curated to your experiences is an idea that's just ripe for the taking and will eventually find its way into reality.
Yeah, I would love for someone to create that and it happen automatically through AI or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I already do it. Like I'm obsessive also with this idea of scoring whatever it is I'm doing in the perfect way with music. And I always do it when I have a really big trail race. So these will be, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 hour races. And I usually try to start off without music just to, you know, get into the rhythm and really get in tune with my body. But after a while, it's like, all right, time to plug in the music and get that boost. And I'll literally spend hours, if not several days beforehand, trying to craft the playlist that I think will benefit me most during that race. So, you know, just thinking about, all right, hours 1 through 3, I think are going to be on this uphill. Hours 3 to 4, I have this section. What type of music do I want for each one of those types of terrains? Or thinking about how I'm going to be feeling, you know, 5 hours into the race, I'll need a few pick-me-ups in the playlist. So yeah, I can only imagine if that were being done for you automatically in all moments of your life. Could be very, very interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I love that you put that amount of love and care into the music that can pull you along on that journey. Definitely the kind of thing I could see myself doing. I guess for a lot of people, like I do a similar thing, I guess, for their gym, if they're for their gym session, if they're someone who's lifting a lot or pushing weights, just to get that little bit extra inspiration, you know. They love some thumping beats to get them all fired up. But yeah, you definitely took it to another level there by the attention of detail for a track for each terrain across your long journey. I think that probably for some people it's scary, the idea of like an automated service. And yeah, there's definitely some scary, slightly big brothery implications for all of this stuff. I guess for me, you know, firstly, it's a part of me that just embraces the reality of where we're going as a civilization. I think it's pretty hard to turn off innovation. Of course, I, like a lot of people, I kind of to and fro about how I feel about all of this, and I have my moments where I'm like, let's just stop and let's just get back to basics.
Yeah.
But assuming that there's nothing that can be done to stop the progression of technology, I think for me, I'd probably be more interested in the curation and designing of people's music. Like, for example, just today I was thinking about how good my Spotify Discover Weekly was. I don't know if you have this experience with it, but I find that some weeks it's really, really good, and then other weeks it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to my roommate's Spotify today, and he had like 3 tracks that have appeared in my feed. And I think someone told me there's a meme about this somewhere, how people are noticing that their Discover Weeklies are very similar, and that all of this music that they thought was obscure, because there are these artists, you know, creating this music that aren't particularly popular or well known, but yet people are really responding heavily to their music, and they think that, oh, you know, I've got these interesting and refined tastes, but then they hear somebody else's to Spotify Weekly, and then like they're playing the exact same quote unquote obscure song.
Yeah.
And my theory, I could be wrong, is that these playlists are actually created by a person, and they actually potentially create the whole playlist from start to finish. Because the one I was listening to today did not, I mean, I've kind of noticed this for a while, but particularly the one I was listening to today did not sound like it was just randomly assorted. Like the music really flowed from one track to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that someone has created the whole list. And so my theory is that there's someone or people that create, like, let's say there's like 50 Discover Weekly playlists going around at the moment, and that one type of playlist goes to a certain type of listener, and one type of playlist goes to another certain type of listener. But essentially, they're still kind of blanket, solid lists that don't just randomly change, if that makes sense. And so my overall point is that whether you think that's really sort of dark and scary, or whether you think that it's troubling that so much of your input is determined by somebody else, I do like, at the very least, the fact that someone has put some thought into the music, and that it is actually curated, and that it's not entirely algorithmic. It is a blend of algorithmic and curation.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Thinking we should screenshot and share each other's
Yeah.
Discover Weekly, see if we find
Yeah.
any patterns. But yeah, with this, what you're mentioning of applying AI to essentially discovery and taste making, the thing that concerns me most is that doing that leads to some type of convergence in everyone's tastes. You know, the way that Airbnbs, for example, like Airbnbs being exclusively rented out, like no one is actually living there full time, all seem to have the same fucking aesthetic.
Right.
There was actually an article written on this, and the same with, you know, interior design boards on Pinterest. I mean, the fact that you can look at a space, for me, it always happens with like an outdoor dinner that has been set up with those little the single light bulbs hanging on the cord, sort of like hanging down. And there's just like, that's very specific look that you look at it and say, that's so Pinterest, you know, that's something you would see on a Pinterest board. And I think it's really cool how different aesthetics can be spread so rapidly and shared with so many people around the globe, and people can sort of iterate on them. But I also feel that there's convergence that happens, and which I don't particularly like, because I love, being exposed to so many different things, and finding people that are doing so many different things. I guess this is sort of bringing us back to where we started with this conversation of people just regurgitating content and regurgitating aesthetics instead of creating something that's totally novel and that's really gonna, shake things up in the world.
Yeah, we have come full circle. And I guess you've just highlighted, at least for me, the fact that if you really want to be serious and work on expanding your mind creatively and beyond, then you basically have to switch off your devices routinely, completely, I guess, and just stop any kind of algorithm affecting your life or influencing your life. Whether that looks like for someone 1 week of absolutely no internet per quarter or every 3 months, or whether it's once a year or whatever. But it's just increasingly feeling like there's no other way if you really do want to be serious and not just end up essentially replicating what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, I just thought of my best friend right now. He's an architect and an interior designer. And I once heard someone ask him who his inspirations were, in both architecture and design. And I absolutely loved his answer to the question, because he said, no one, none of them. And that his main inspiration is just the time that he spends out in nature and looking at plants, looking at the designs that you see in trees and vines and leaves and so on. And that mindset is definitely reflected in the work that he does, because he makes these super crazy buildings, decorates spaces in like very crazy psychedelic ways, and it's definitely not for everyone. And I think that'll be true of any creation that's not purely a remixing or regurgitation of something that came before it. But I'd much prefer to have more of that in the world, people creating stuff that's not going to be for everyone, but for the people who do like it, that it does resonate with them and speak to them. That's going to happen on a much deeper level than this safer content that's being put out in mass.
Totally. Yeah, I feel the same way. I was just thinking of Kanye West, actually, to cite a very controversial figure. He said in a David Letterman interview, where David Letterman was talking about how, potentially Kanye has responsibility with his voice, that he has a lot of power with his influence. And Kanye said that he said to a friend of his that also said the same thing, that his response was, no, my power is that I'm not influenced. I think I'm articulating that more or less correctly. Mm-hmm. But essentially the idea is that, yeah, his real power comes from just not listening to what anyone else says. And whether you love or hate Kanye, I do think that particular idea is a really important one. Mm-hmm. And it's something that I am increasingly becoming aware of and trying to embody myself, because like most people, I've been very guilty of caring what other people think, and very guilty of, on some level, subconsciously or consciously, riding certain trends and just being aware of like the market and what people want and what works, what sells, etc., etc. I mean, I don't want to, do myself a disservice and suggest that I've had too many compromises, or that I've succumbed to the masses or anything like that. I've always tried to just do my own thing, but it really takes a special someone to be able to completely block out those pressures and that voice that tells you you need to do a certain type of thing a certain way. And I think for creatives, and I would just say for people in general, like a big part of, living a fruitful life and really getting the most out of this world is being able to turn off that impulse of wanting to conform and to really harness the voice deep within you that has something unique to say, and as we've suggested, can be influenced from real world experiences and primary experiences that are going to just have your own take on a situation rather than somebody else's take on a situation.
Yeah, totally. And I'm curious, in your case, what does that look like for you? Besides, I feel like the first part is turning off the phone, metaphorically, like cutting yourself off from all those content streams. But then the second step has to be going out into the world, or going in within yourself and searching for those primary experiences that are gonna inspire and influence your art. So I'm curious, in your case, what does that look like?
So definitely very much, it's constantly evolving in terms of how I can enact this philosophy, so to speak. And I am definitely not an arbiter or a glowing example of everything we've discussed. I feel like I've definitely fallen into the traps and failings that so many people have these days with technology consumption. But I would say that I basically don't really watch films anymore. I probably see 6 films a year ish. I was, I think, more or less addicted to films in my 20s. There was a period where I had to watch a film a day. And obviously that was an informative part of my life, and probably a very important part in terms of developing an understanding of film. But yeah, these days it's very much the opposite. So that's a big thing in terms of, whatever medium you're operating in, just not really consuming much of that medium. It's a little bit extreme, but I'm personally living it when it comes to film. I just don't really watch much film or TV. I'm trying to read more than anything. That's actually a Werner Herzog thing, as he's big on reading. He believes that reading is the perfect way to learn about storytelling, and I think for him it's also more of a direct pathway to the real world. There's potentially a purity to the reading experience where you're not, if you're reading a book, you're not reading what might be a panel of people deciding on every bit of stimulus that you're encountering. So take, for example, a blockbuster film, like, sure, Michael Bay is the director, but in a lot of blockbuster films, there's a huge amount of filtering that will happen from producers, executive producers in studios, etc. And the whole idea of a panel of people, making creative choices, design choices, is a very real thing. So I'm just thinking on the fly now that there's probably something to be said on reading consumption as being a slightly lesser of evil when it comes to finding inspiration that already exists, that isn't necessarily a real world experience, but nonetheless is being experienced just through one person only. So that's the current flavor of the month when it comes to what I'm trying to do for myself personally. I guess I've been a little bit lucky when it comes to real world experiences that have had a huge amount of variety, with those being mixed race. I spent a lot of my time in the Philippines growing up, which was just a stark contrast to Australia, which is where I primarily grew up. The Philippines, being a third world country, definitely provided a huge amount of new and interesting stimulus and experiences that I think colored my upbringing and who I am today. And I just saw a lot of Asia growing up. I would travel a lot to see my mom in various Asian countries, And then pursuing film mostly in the advertising world has also involved a lot of traveling. Obviously, I told you about my Papua New Guinea story, which is a result of doing film and video work. And that's kind of been an ongoing thing where, yeah, I get thrust into these new environments and locations and new people. So filmmaking, if you're out there shooting, has this embedded quality to it, which I do think is useful. And yeah, a bit of other travel in my personal life, I think in recent years has helped a lot with this. But I think moving forward for me now, you know, we talked about psychedelics, for example, and yeah, I mean, some trips to South America, I definitely think are on the cards. And I feel like for me, as someone who lives in New York, I've just very much appreciated the necessity to get out of this city as regularly as I can financially afford. Mm-hmm. And yeah, hopefully try and get some new experiences. And then the other side of the spectrum in terms of back to the curbing thing, yeah, like I said, I don't watch much film and TV, and I'm pretty good with the old social media these days. I don't spend too much time on them, and I'm pretty damn ruthless with my feed. And I do think that's something a lot of people could benefit from. Like, I don't follow very many people, and yeah, I'm very, very careful about what goes into my eyeballs and ear holes.
That's important.
Yeah.
So maybe to go wrapping up, what role does shit posting on Twitter play in your creative process?
Was that a question that you pre-planned? It sounded
no, not at all.
Okay.
Very much in the moment.
That's a really good question, actually, because I feel like I've been ranting to some people lately about how much Twitter has literally changed my life. And a lot of it is just because of the fact that I feel like I've landed in this particular pocket of Twitter that is just so aligned with a lot of my values. And it feels so reassuring to know that I'm not alone, that there are people that are sort of moving through the world in a similar way and seeing the events of the world play out in a similar way. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, in terms of like the creative aspect to it, I'm like increasingly finding that I'm looking back at old tweets and finding ways to intertwine them into my writings. Like, for example, with this feature film that I'm writing, there are some tweets that I think will literally be ideas in that film, either story plots or dialogue or, yeah, really, really anything that might wiggle its way into the film. And that's like crazy to me, you know, this thing that so many people just don't take seriously as this, you know, almost guilty pleasure that you do while you're sitting on the toilet is actually, you know, part of the formative stages of really big and important work. And I really put that down to the fact that the art of tweeting, so to speak, or shit posting, mm-hmm. For many people is very much a stream of consciousness thing. I mean, that I think for a lot of posters, a lot of good posters, is a big quality of posting. You know, it's this kind of direct pathway to your brain whereby you can type it out so quickly, you can hit send so quickly. You know that a lot of the tweets that do well tend to be these kind of bizarre snippets of your subconscious that even you yourself barely understand. And so there's this huge incentive there, you know, if you want it to be seen, if you want it to land on people's feeds, if you want it to get liked and retweeted, you kind of know that it's often best to not overthink it and to be as kind of raw in your decision-making as possible as you blurt out or vomit out these ideas in the nether regions of your brain. And so that forced process over now, you know, nearly 2 years of tweeting, I think has been really good for just regurgitating or discovering some stuff happening in my head that otherwise may have remained dormant and unseen had I not the incentive and motivation to throw it out there publicly and have it recorded for me to then, you know, look back on it months and years later.
Yeah, that's awesome to have that store of ideas to resurface later on in time and see which ones can be useful in whatever project you have on the table at that moment.
I'd like to throw the question back to you though. What do you think shitposting has as value for you in your life? Do you feel like you're shitposting? Because I mean, the thing that I'm always commenting is that I find that your posting is very sincere, which I love, and I think I'm, you know, kind of a blend of doing that sometimes and sometimes not as much. But do you think that you're more of a shitposter, or how do you see your tweeting?
I guess I just use shit posting for all sorts of tweeting just because I love the word. But if I, you know, answer that question more generally, just what being on Twitter has done for me. In these past, I guess I've been like 5 months on Twitter. Yeah, what you said resonates a lot. Like just sort of tapping into my stream of consciousness and starting to share bits and pieces of it has been a really cool experience, in the sense that previously I would have worried way too much about taking the idea and trying to refine it and package it in a way that I think would be, you know, good enough to put out there in the world and let it be seen by other people. Again, this sort of pattern motivated by a mindset of trying to be liked and accepted by others, right? So using Twitter as an opportunity to just override that barrier, like not care about refining it, packaging it, editing it into something that's better, but just sort of off the cuff tweeting, like whatever crazy ideas going through my head, has been super cool. It's definitely allowed me to, it's sort of like flexing that muscle of being able to take an idea and then express it with very little time or filtering or editing in between.
And also, I guess, the potency of having to deliver it in 280 characters as well. Yeah.
So yeah, that's been a lot of fun. And I've found how, you know, sometimes I'll tweet something or make a thread has had too much overthinking. You know, it's like I've already thought I want to do this thread about this subject, and I sit down and start typing it out. Like those never really land that well, nor are they super fun to create. And on the other hand, the ones that just sort of, you know, I don't know, someone asked the question and it's just like, you have the exact answer for it because it's something that you've experienced, you've lived through, and therefore what you start replying is coming from a very personal place. Those are the experiences on Twitter that I love, you know, because as you're typing it out, it's just like, it's sort of like you've been sitting around the dinner table and maybe you've been sort of quiet and then someone mentions something and you just have to say something about it. And it's not so much because you're trying to make a point or have people agree with you, but it's just like, I've lived this and I have this really intense experience relating to this and I just want to share it and put it out there for other people to see. Those are like the juiciest moments of tweeting. And I find that almost always they're accompanied by a lot of engagement from other people, because I think that sort of emotion does get transmitted in how you write it in the 280 characters, and people pick up on that somehow, and it like activates you, it engages you. So yeah, I think that for me would be the biggest part of this Twitter experience.
You just helped me realize that it has been kind of reassuring and I guess a little bit heartwarming to be reminded or to learn that whenever you do express yourself in a way that is particularly raw and authentic and from the heart or soul, that it tends to do better than anything that is, too well polished or considered or finessed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just really nice to be constantly reminded of that from people, you know. I mean, obviously it depends a little bit on who's following you, but so long as you have a decent crowd of followers, I find that really encouraging. And I think it has probably helped me, not just with my Twitter experience, but also just in life in general, to know that deep down, like, people really want you to kind of shed layers and reveal yourself, and they're there for it.
Yeah, totally. And I would say that, you know, people responding to this sort of this type of tweeting that's like raw or very off the cuff or vulnerable or what have you. I think that a lot of people engage with it is more reflective of this little corner of Twitter that we hang out in, right? Like, I don't know if it would be the same in other parts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do agree with you that Twitter, like, I see Twitter as like the 5-pound dumbbell, you know? It's like the first step to start building certain muscles. And in this case, the muscle is just speaking your mind more freely and like not self-editing as much or not worrying as much about how you're going to be perceived, and being willing to dive into that vulnerability. And for sure, it's a lot easier to do it when it's being mediated through your smartphone and being shared with a bunch of, you know, anime avatars and people without real names. Like, they're still, it's like lower stakes, you know, so it's easier to pick up that first weight. And I've found that as I get better and more comfortable doing it online, picking up the 10-pound dumbbell in real life with my in real life friends starts feeling a little bit easier than had I just gone directly to that level.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that idea can apply to a lot of things. So yeah, I definitely see Twitter as a super interesting, you know, laboratory in which to do all these experiments with yourself, and, you know, before trying to do them in your real life.
Yeah. And I guess on that note, this is another one of those experiments that we're doing right now, I guess.
The podcast, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Just experiments within experiments. Well, Byron, I think that's a good place to end this one.
Awesome. Thank you, Harvey. It has been a pleasure.
Yeah, great chat as usual, and thanks a lot for coming on this podcast.
Awesome. It was great. I'll chat to you later.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.